Hey everyone, this is the Rewriter writing in. For today's video, I will be adding on to my blueprints collection by looking at Assassin's Creed and seeing what my ideal AC game would look like. I'll be explaining how I would want the game to look and feel, the gameplay mechanics, and overall character progression, as well as touching on story elements. I'm also going to preface this video by saying that I know that this type of game will never happen, as Ubisoft are dead set on killing this franchise by having the next game be live service. However, it is fun to talk about a series that I used to love, so I'm going to do just that. Now, before we get deeper into the video, if you enjoy this type of content and want to see more, then leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, as this really helps me grow. So with this out of the way, let's dive into my ideal AC game. Assassin's Creed is a franchise that I have a love-hate relationship with. On the one hand, some of my favorite open-world action-adventure games are the early entries in the series, those being the first one through Revelations, and also Unity. In these games, we have a likable protagonist, good villains, and a fun world to explore. And while these games don't have the best open worlds or the most interesting quest variety, they are no doubt still very fun games with incredible stories. Ezio in particular was such a likable character with realistic motivations and a great character arc. We see him go from being this cocky young man to this wise master assassin over the course of his trilogy, and I feel that he was a character that was really well written. Something that I loved about the second game in particular was how you didn't start off in the Brotherhood, but were brought into it after Ezio's family was killed. I believe that stories that start in this similar style are fun to watch how everything unfolds. But, on the other hand, I really hate the new style of AC games with a heavy focus on open combat and RPG elements that act more like pay to progress, to be honest, and literally no focus on stealth or assassinations. I mean, in AC Odyssey, you're not even an assassin in the Brotherhood. You're just some mercenary that just so happens to be a descendant of Leonidas. What's most frustrating about this game, and even Valhalla, is that stealth is not the most viable option. Open combat is. I know Valhalla made all these claims that stealth was coming back in a major way, but from the few hours of this game that I played, stealth was basically never viable. This is because the game would either glitch out, or the AI would have the hearing of Superman, and be able to hear me drop from far away. The stealth feels nowhere near as polished as it does in the early entries. This is because being stealthy was the whole point. However, if you were spotted, you could still fight in open combat. And I believe that even the combat in the originals is far superior to the combat that we get in the newer entries. In newer entries, we have this whole fleshed out combat system with many tiers of progression. Now, this isn't the bad part. What makes it suck is that the combat does its best to make you feel underpowered and weak. Every enemy that you come across in the newer era of AC take a million hits to kill, with you only being able to take a few hits before you die. See, in the originals, you really felt like a master assassin, because every time you got into a fight, you had the feeling of being in control. You could wipe out an entire mob of enemies in under a minute if you got the gameplay mechanics down. While some may argue that the combat was boring, I enjoyed the fact that you felt powerful, unlike in these new games. As well, I just don't feel like the storytelling and characters even come remotely close to what we used to get back in the day. So now that I've briefly talked about what I like and dislike about the AC franchise, let's now dive into the main topic of today's video, my ideal game. I'll be breaking this up into multiple small parts so that I'm not talking about everything all at once, as there is a lot that I want to go over. So let's start with the location and time period. My ideal location and time period would be in feudal Japan during the Tensho-Iga War of 1579. A fictional story in this backdrop would be perfect, as this war was between the samurai of the Oda clan and the ninjas of the League of All Commons of Iga. Here we can have the Assassin's Brotherhood forming in Iga, and the Templars controlling forces from the Oda clan. Of course, the events that would play out during the main story would be fictional, but the setting is rooted in reality. Plus, this era screams for an AC game to be made in it. It's literally the perfect time period. So let's now talk about the tone and atmosphere of this game. Now, I'm going to be bringing up this other game quite a bit, as this would be an obvious inspiration. I would want these components to feel like Ghost of Tsushima. I really like how the whole situation feels dire, as Tsushima is in the middle of a war between two clans. There are fires everywhere, but also scenes of nature and its beauty. This conflicting imagery would make for a compelling backdrop for the war going on inside of it. I also love how the game shifts tone dramatically, as Jin is becoming the ghost, instead of this honorable warrior that he once was. I love when the world is changed by the actions of the characters in it. So now I want to talk about the map in the game world. Ghost of Tsushima's map design encouraged exploration by providing collectibles, hidden secrets, optional boss battles, and new regions. This is something that I feel recent AC maps have lacked, a real drive to go out and explore, because the map feels so generic and way too expansive. The map in my ideal AC game would be a lot more like Ghost of Tsushima, smaller than most maps, but a lot denser in details and content. I want, as the player, to feel a sense of excitement as I explore the map, knowing that I will be rewarded with weapons, armor, and skills to put into my character progression. Ghost of Tsushima also did a good job at making regions feel different, even when the game takes place on the same island. AC needs to adopt this level of world building and unique map design. Finally, something that has been plaguing AC games since Origins is the lack of buildings and structures that encourage the unique parkour and movement that the earlier games promoted so heavily. I'm not saying that every square inch of this map has to be littered with buildings, as there can be large areas of open expanse to showcase the beauty of the landscape, but there should be more towers, forts, strongholds, and the like. This would give the player more incentive to use parkour to navigate through the world. So let's now talk about these gameplay elements, which includes parkour like I mentioned before, melee combat, and stealth. And let's start off with that parkour. There's no doubt that the parkour and mobility of the AC games have taken a major backseat when it comes to level design in recent years. Most of the area is open land, so you just use your horse to get around. While having a horse is convenient for distant travel, your main mode of transportation should be parkour. In Origins especially, I found myself just running through the streets most of the time, as there were very little structures for me to parkour on, and it turned into a running simulator. In contrast to this, the first few AC games doubled down on the parkour as their defining feature. The fastest way to get to your targets was by rooftop, which not only made you feel badass, but also that you were using your environment in a creative way that would outsmart your enemy. AC Unity by far has the best parkour system in the entire franchise. It's smooth, fluid, responsive, and looks sick as hell. There are still gameplay videos being made today, showcasing the incredible parkour system and how next-gen it truly was. Why the newer AC games abandoned this parkour system entirely is just beyond me. So for my ideal game, this parkour system would be used, as it's just incredible to look at. Let's get to the melee combat now. In recent AC games, the combat system has been entirely overhauled to allow for more customization in terms of weapon builds and stats. While this sounds like a great evolution to the gameplay, I actually feel that it's a major step back from the originals. While the originals didn't have a complex melee system, I don't feel like they ever needed one. This is because you're not some axe-wielding warrior, but a stealthy and highly skilled assassin. The fights that you should get into should end pretty quickly, as your combat skills far outweigh the common guard or soldier. However, in these newer games, you don't feel powerful. Quite the opposite, actually. You feel incredibly weak against most foes, as they take many attacks to actually kill, making you feel like you're swinging a pool noodle at people instead of a sword. Something I hate about this system is the fact that if you try and fight opponents that are too high level, you literally do no damage. It's such a lazy way to stifle the player's progression. It feels like a cop-out instead of being outmatched. So for my game, I'd have the combat go back to the original style of simpler combat to showcase your character's incredible skill. That doesn't mean that every enemy type needs to be able to be killed with one hit, as there should still be tough enemies, along with boss battles, but the combat should be more fluid and fast-paced, and should end much quicker than your standard fight in any of the new AC games. In this respect, I also feel that Unity did the combat well, making it feel like the classic combat system, but adding a bit higher skill level with the perfect parries and dodge mechanics. My ideal game would take elements of Unity's combat as well as pulling from the originals. Now for the stealth, which would be a radical overhaul from what we've been getting with the last few AC titles. Firstly, stealth would be at the forefront of the gameplay experience, not melee combat. Melee combat would be reserved for if you screwed your mission up, or if a set piece threw the player into the thick of the action. Other than that, stealth would be the primary gameplay element, and the most optimal way for you to get to your target. Social stealth would be brought back in a major way, along with the many gadgets that you used to have in previous titles, like bombs and the Phantom Blade. Of course, the gadgets would be different because of the time period, but you get the point. You want to feel like an ancient Batman, moving through the shadows and taking down your enemies with gadgets and weaponry. Going back to Unity, it did stealth and target assassinations incredibly well. You are shown who your target is and where they are located in the level, but you are also shown multiple routes to reach your target. From there, it is up to the creativity of the player to dispatch the target in whichever way they see fit. And not only this, but running out into open combat is highly discouraged, as you will get swarmed by enemies and it becomes tough to get out of there. I like this mechanic, as it heavily encourages stealth over open combat. But like I said, the melee combat wouldn't leave you feeling scared to fight because your character is weak. To counter the idea of coming in swords blazing and taking out your target like that, I think it could be interesting to have your target retreat from their location and move to a more secure one if you're spotted. And if you're really bad at stealth and keep getting spotted multiple times, then you are put on a timer, and if it runs out, your target gets away. This doesn't give you a mission fail, but does affect the story if you let your target get away. I feel that this would give a good sense of challenge and consequences for your gameplay. And touching on this subject of mission structure, I want to mention a couple ideas for how levels in my game would play out. Let's talk about one of the most hated level designs in the AC franchise, the tailing missions. Everyone hates these because of how strict and punishing they are for making even the slightest mistake on them. I agree with these criticisms, but I wouldn't want to remove them from the game, as this has become the staple of the franchise. However, there is room to improve this mission type. One improvement that I thought of is that if you're tailing your target for a little bit, but end up losing them in the crowd, instead of getting desynchronized, you end up completing the mission, but only having whatever intel you gained from the parts of the conversation that you heard. This will have consequences, as the Templars have plans that you are now not aware of, which means that they will have the upper hand on the assassins. Another improvement that I made is that if you're spotted, again, instead of a mission fail, you now have to chase the target and interrogate them. The success of the interrogation will depend on how much of the conversation you heard. If you only slipped up in the end, then you will have plenty of leverage on them, and it will be an easy interrogation. If you mess up near the beginning, you have less leverage on them, making it a much tougher one. I really hate the idea of getting mission fails in modern games, as I feel that there is more potential narratively to have repercussions for your actions, and have the story play out based on your actions. My inspiration for this idea is the Dishonored franchise. Depending on how you choose to play the game, slaughtering everyone you come across or playing as a pacifist will change the final level, either having it be destroyed and war-torn, or having it be a lot more held together. I love this idea, but I would tweak it so that this change is not only seen in the final level, but throughout the story. But the change wouldn't come from if you kill or not, as this is an AC game. Nobody wants to play as a pacifist here. It would come from consequences during missions, like I explained above. And as far as the stronghold or tower takeover missions that we have seen in many AC games, I think it would be cool to have different objectives for each of them. One time you're rescuing hostages, the next you have to kill an important Templar controlling the base, or you have to take your base back from a Templar invasion. An element that I think could be cool for this mission type is to have it sort of act like Middle-earth Shadow of War, where once you have control of a stronghold, you can upgrade it so that if another attack comes, you are more prepared for it. It can act as a fun minigame, building resources to make your strongholds the toughest they can be. I feel that these improvements will make this tired mission type have a bit more life and replay value. Now, in terms of traditional side quests with their own storyline, not one-off missions like I've described above, I would want these to be handled kind of like Batman Arkham City's side quests. While not every side quest in this game is perfect, I feel that this game has some of the best of them, as they are fun to play and have you tracking down a particular villain in most of them. I think this idea of tracking down lesser villains presented throughout the story would be a fun way to take a break from the main quest. I would have each of these lesser villains be decently fleshed out. They don't have to be as complex as the main villain would be, but enough where I have an understanding of their goals and a legitimate reason why I am tracking them down. So now that we've talked about the game world, gameplay, and overhauled mission types, let's now talk about the main characters in this game. And yes, I said main characters. That's because this game would have two characters that you can choose to play as at the start of the game. This is an aspect that I actually find to be an interesting idea in the newer AC games. However, they don't execute this very well. In Odyssey, you can choose to play as either Alexios or Cassandra, and whoever you don't choose becomes the main villain of the game as a twist. I really like this idea. However, I don't like that Alexios and Cassandra are literally the exact same person, just male or female. I know that you can choose to play each of them a little differently, but I would have preferred if choosing your character felt more impactful. Now, instead of evolving this concept in Valhalla, they decided to take a major step back in my opinion. Instead of having two separate characters, you can only choose to play as male or female Ivor. And to make matters even worse, you can change genders in between missions, so one mission you're male Ivor and the next you're female. And not only is this concept just goofy as hell, but also breaks any and all immersion the game had. This is because your character is inconsistent and exists merely as an idea instead of a fully fleshed out character. So for my game, I'd go back to the idea of two characters, with one being male and the other female. However, this execution would be drastically different from what we got in Odyssey. My idea for the male would be to start his campaign as neutral, but leaning towards the side of the assassins. His family's been killed and he's living on the streets, just barely surviving. The themes and ideas presented in his story involve survival of the fittest, proving oneself, and contemplation on morality. Through a series of events, he is contacted by the Assassin's Brotherhood and tested to see if he is worthy to join their ranks. Just a note on the Brotherhood, in this game, I'd want them to look and act similar to how they do in Unity. I love how shadowy and mysterious the Order is, how it's more like a cult than a band of brothers. This dark tone and atmosphere would work really well in making the Brotherhood seem far more dangerous than they let on. Now going back to the plot, your character learns the ways of the assassin and joins their guild. However, the Brotherhood has him doing some morally questionable acts, and here is where the game would take a drastic turn from every other AC game in the franchise. Here, the player can choose to either stay with the Brotherhood or abandon them and find himself siding with the Templars. I think that this would be an awesome twist and a breath of fresh air for the franchise. We get to see that both factions in the war do bad things, not just the Templars. From this perspective, we can see the values of each faction and decide for ourselves which side we align ourselves with. Fleshing out the motivations and traditions of each of these factions would steer them away from being simple good and evil sides, and present complex choices of morality and your character's place in the world. In my opinion, this would make the franchise vastly more interesting and thought-provoking. The plot could then go in two directions from here. He leaves the Order and joins the Templars, or stays with the Order and enacts their will. Whichever side he chooses will have an impact on the world, which would continue throughout the end of the game. For the female, she would start off as Templar. Born into the royal house, she is next in line to take over her father's Templar army. The themes and ideas presented in her story involve birthrights, continuing tradition, and finding self-worth. Her story would take a similar trajectory as the male characters would, as she would see what the Templars do and their mission. It would be awesome if each of these factions felt very different, not just in tradition and motivation, but also stylistically. With the Brotherhood feeling like a mysterious cult, the Templars should feel more like an organized army or a regime. This way, it can almost feel like an indoctrinated army believing in the grand goals of the glorious Templar order. Additionally, their warriors fight in the light as icons to the people, not skulking in the shadows dishonorably. I use words like cult and indoctrinated to show that both sides of this war are flawed in one way or another, and that there is a lot more gray than the typical black and white that we see in most AC games. And just like the male, the female can choose partway through the story to side with the assassins over the Templar Order. Something I do want to mention before I move on from this is that these protagonists will be similar to Odyssey, where they will interact with each other from time to time during the story. Depending on your choices, you can either ally yourself with the other playable character, or be enemies with them, which would make them the final boss of the game. That way, there is a built-up chemistry between them that makes the final fight gripping and engaging if you decide to be enemies. Transitioning over to another aspect of these characters, let's talk about the Armory System and their gameplay types. I use this term instead of loot, as I want to stay far away from live service style games. The armory would be different depending on which faction that you choose to ally yourself with. All weapons and armor can be purchased at vendors with in-game money, or rewarded for completion of missions or challenges. For the Assassin's Brotherhood, they can wear light to medium armor, as stealth is the name of the game for them, so they can't wear super bulky armor. As far as their weapons are concerned, they can use wakizashi, kogatanas, hand claws, kaiutetsu shoge, and of course, the hidden blade. They are also lethal with their fists, using jujitsu in close quarters combat when they are unarmed. An aspect that sets the assassins apart is their wide variety of gadgets at their disposal. These include blowguns, poison darts, shurikens, flash powder grenades, smoke bombs, and climbing hooks. These give the assassins an advantage when it comes to stealth maneuvers and assassinations. The playstyle of the assassin is quiet and lethal, killing their target with precision and getting away unseen. While they can fight in open combat, this is not their way, so this style of play is discouraged in many scenarios. Now, on the flip side to this, the Templar playstyle is much more aggressive and melee focused. Even though I explained that stealth would be the forefront of the gameplay experience, I didn't want to ruin the twist of choosing your side during the story. So, what I'm saying is that there are actually two main play styles that you can choose during the story that let you cater to your preferred method of combat. Now, I know that I explained previously how I hate the fact that AC games have transitioned over from the forefront being stealth to it being open combat, so why would I still want these elements in my game? Well, for starters, I would still tweak the combat system so that it feels more like the originals so that you don't feel super weak. But also, I hated this direction because in the previous two games, you are supposed to be playing as an assassin, yet you barely use stealth. However, I never said that I would oppose this gameplay style if you weren't playing as an assassin. So, the Templars wear heavy armor, and their weapons reflect this brutality. The player can use katanas, tantos, naganatas, yaris, and the yumai. While they don't have any gadgets like the assassins do, they make up for this by having increased health from their armor, as well as increased range with the use of the bow. This character type plays very much like Cassandra or Ivar would, preferring open combat to stealth. One note that I want to make is that if the player chooses to follow the Templar path, assassination target missions transition from being like I described above and turn more into the sieges that we see in Valhalla. The reason for having these two styles of play is that they can capitalize on both sides of their audience. Those who prefer the old school style of stealth being the main focus, and those who like the new style of more melee focused gameplay. I would want this game to focus heavily on player choice, making each decision meaningful for the player. This would open up so many avenues for the player to replay the campaign mission multiple times, as there are so many different choices to be made. As far as the progression system is concerned, for the most part, I would want this to be fairly standard, with skill trees branching out for stealth, combat, and individual skills like crafting and chemistry for bombs. having skill trees makes the progression fun and helps the player feel increasingly more powerful as the story progresses. The next point is going to be controversial, so before you go hating me in the comments section, just hear me out. In my ideal game, there would be no modern day story and no aliens or ancient artifacts. For me, the modern day story has gotten so bad that I would rather it just not be in there. I feel that the story of the original games got held back a bit because of the disjointed nature of being torn out of the story to go back to the modern day. And honestly, who wanted to go back to the modern day while we were following Ezio and his adventures? Ezio was a lot more interesting than Desmond was. So I'd rather them just not have it instead of try and cram it into the story. The next point is the aliens, whose inclusion I never felt was necessary in telling this story. What's wrong with the premise of two warring factions that have battled for centuries and each game focuses on a different time period? Why did they need to throw aliens in the mix? This plot already hooked me, but when they added this unnecessary convolution to it, it made my eyes roll every time these sections came up. So for me, I'd rather these two aspects just be removed from this title entirely. Finally, the last thing that I would want in this ideal game is a full multiplayer suite that acts as a celebration of all the multiplayer that came before. In this multiplayer, there would be 3 modes: the original that started in Brotherhood, the co-op from Unity, and a new one that I came up with. Let's start with the original. In this mode, 7 players are brought into a match, and from here it is a free-for-all. You are then given your target, another player that's hunting someone else. Additionally, all the NPCs are each of the player characters, making it confusing to find your actual target. It's up to you to distinguish who's a player and who's an NPC. Even though my description isn't very good, this game mode was really fun. The next mode would be the co-op from Unity. As the name suggests, these are co-op missions that revolve around assassination targets styled from the campaign. There are 4 players in total, and you all have to work together to take down your target in the most efficient way possible. This mode would be so awesome in a new AC game because playing co-op has always been a dream of OG fans, but it wasn't the best in Unity. Plus, having a more chill mode to play other than the story is a major plus for those who don't enjoy competitive multiplayer. The final mode is one that's inspired by Spies vs Mercs, but with the AC formula. Instead of spies, there are assassins, and instead of mercs, Templars. I was thinking that it could be cool if it remained a 2v2 mode, but with the objective of a target that the assassins need to kill while the Templars are protecting them. I feel that this multiplayer mode could be the most competitive out of the 3, and would make for some intense matches. Having a multiplayer in any game increases its replay value immensely, but only when it's made right, and not made to feel tacked on like a lot of multiplayer has felt in the past. I feel that the newer Assassin's Creed games made a mistake by not including multiplayer, as this adds more replay value than just the campaign can. In all, this AC game would be incredibly ambitious, but I don't feel that it's altogether unrealistic to make. In essence, this game would be a celebration of the franchise, bringing back old features while keeping in some features from the newer games. Spicing up the mission structures and adding player choices in terms of your character and your faction would go a long way in solidifying the RPG elements that the newer games try to capture. This game would act as an incredible in-between for fans of both the old and new era of AC. You would have the major return of stealth and parkour for the classic fans if you chose to play as an assassin. If you choose to play Templar, then you would have the new style of open combat over stealth. This would please all fans and would sell really well, at least in my opinion. There would be so many ways to play this campaign, and it would be exciting doing another playthrough but making completely different choices. The cherry on top would be the multiplayer that would add hundreds of hours of enjoyment after the campaign is over. So that's my ideal Assassin's Creed game. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think about this game? Do you like my ideas or not? What would your ideal game look like? Let me know all of this in the comments below. Also, if you enjoy gaming streams and want to hang out and chat with me, then feel free to check out my second channel, Rewriter Gaming, where I stream some games and hang out with you. The link for that is in the description below. Leave a like on the video and subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks again, everyone, and this is the Rewriter writing out.